Good evening, detectives. Welcome back to Blackwood Academy. Over the past 3 weeks, investigators have released evidence from the scene of Professor Vanessa Hammond's death, documented the layout of Hawthorne Hall, and begun assembling the facts surrounding what happened on Monday, June 8th. This week, the investigation takes another important step forward. Earlier today, investigators authorized the public release of several additional pieces of information, including the official timeline of Professor Hammond's final day, excerpts from newly completed witness interviews, and a summary of the completed autopsy. Let's begin with the timeline. As with any active homicide investigation, establishing a reliable timeline is one of the most important tasks investigators face. Every witness statement, every surveillance image, every phone call, and every piece of physical evidence must ultimately fit somewhere within it. While investigators caution that additional details may refine the timeline as the investigation continues, the following represents the sequence of events as they are currently understood. 6:45 a.m., Professor Hammond's vehicle enters the Blackwood Academy campus. 7:02 a.m., she enters Hawthorne Hall. 8:00 a.m., her office hours begin. And at 10 a.m., Professor Hammond attends a scheduled faculty meeting. At 11:35 a.m., she is observed leaving the faculty lounge. At 1 p.m., she starts student advising appointments. At 2:45 p.m., she returns to Office 214. At 4:10 p.m., investigators confirm Professor Hammond's final known email activity. At 5:18 p.m., security cameras capture Professor Hammond entering Hawthorne Hall. It should be noted here that there is no video coverage showing her leaving Office 214 or Hawthorne Hall between the hours of 2:45 p.m. and when she's re-entering at 5:18 p.m. We're not sure what happened to that video. At 5:21 p.m., she is last observed entering Office 214. At 6 p.m., she's expected to arrive at the faculty blood drive, but never arrives. At 7:34 p.m., Administrative Assistant Claire Donnelly reports concern after Professor Hammond cannot be located. At 7:42 p.m., Academy personnel check Office 214. At 7:47 p.m., Professor Vanessa Hammond is discovered unresponsive inside her office. At 7:53 p.m., emergency services are contacted. At 8:04 p.m., law enforcement arrives and secures Hawthorne Hall. At first glance, the timeline appears remarkably ordinary. Professor Hammond completed what seemed to be a typical workday before returning to her office shortly after 5 o'clock. Then, something happened. Nearly 2.5 hours passed between the moment Professor Hammond was last seen entering Office 214 and the moment she was discovered. What occurred during that time remains one of the central questions of this investigation. The Broward County Sheriff's Office confirms that investigators continue processing evidence recovered from Office 214. An encrypted USB flash drive recovered during the investigation remains under forensic examination. Several items have been submitted for additional laboratory testing, and investigators continue reviewing witness statements alongside available campus surveillance footage. Authorities have confirmed that no arrests have been made. As additional evidence becomes available, detectives can expect portions of the investigation to be updated accordingly. Next, investigators turned their attention away from the crime scene and toward the people who knew Professor Hammond best. One of the first individuals interviewed at length was Administrative Assistant Claire Donnelly. Claire has served as Administrative Assistant in Hawthorne Hall for just over 2 years. It was she who first raised concerns when Professor Hammond failed to arrive for the faculty blood drive, and it was Claire who ultimately discovered Professor Hammond inside Office 214. Earlier this week, I sat down with Ms. Donnelly to discuss both her relationship with Professor Hammond and the events leading up to June 8th. The complete interview remains part of the investigative file. The following excerpts have been approved for public release. Let's start at the beginning. When did you first meet Professor Hammond? My first day at Blackwood. I was overwhelmed. I couldn't remember anyone's name. I didn't know where anything was. And I was convinced I was going to make a terrible first impression. Vanessa stopped by my desk that morning to introduce herself. What was your first impression of her? Honestly, I thought she seemed intimidating. She was confident, very polished, the kind of person who always seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Then she came back a little while later carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled and said, "I have a feeling you're going to need this." That was Vanessa. So when did your relationship become more than professional? I'm not sure it changed all at once. It just grew. Some people become friends because they have something dramatic in common. We became friends because of 1,000 tiny conversations. Lunch breaks, long days, faculty meetings that ran forever. She was one of my closest friends. Was that something people at Blackwood knew? Not really. We kept our personal lives separate from work. I think most people assumed we were simply coworkers. Did Professor Hammond seem different on June 8th? Yes. Not dramatically. If you didn't know her, you probably wouldn't have noticed. She just seemed distracted, like part of her mind was somewhere else. Did she tell you why? No, but I wish she had. During the interview, Claire mentioned one faculty member repeatedly while describing Professor Hammond's daily routine. Dr. Herman Vale. Dr. Vale has taught history at Blackwood Academy for more than 20 years. Colleagues describe him as thoughtful, opinionated, and deeply respected by both faculty and students. According to Claire Donnelly, Professor Hammond and Dr. Vale spent years challenging one another's ideas and conversations that became well known throughout Hawthorne Hall. Earlier this week, I met with Dr. Vale. The following excerpts have been approved for release. Claire Donnelly said the two of you debated constantly. That's accurate. I see. Arguments? No, Miss Ashcroft. Arguments are about winning. Vanessa and I were interested in understanding. Those are two very different goals. When did you first meet Professor Hammond? Faculty orientation. She corrected one of the guest speakers before he'd even finished introducing himself. I remember thinking, well, this should be interesting. And was it? For 7 amazing years, Detective. What kind of person was Professor Hammond? What kind of person was she? She refused easy answers, Detective. Whether you were discussing ethics, history, or even where to order lunch, she wanted to know why. People like that aren't always easy to live with, but they do make you think. When did you last see her? Late afternoon on the day she died. She mentioned stopping by her office before heading to the blood drive. Did anything about that conversation stand out to you? Only in hindsight. At the time, no. Looking back, she seemed distracted. I asked if everything was all right. She smiled, said, "Later, Herman." That was the last conversation we ever had. Investigators have also begun interviewing additional members of the Blackwood Academy faculty. One of those individuals is Margaret Hale, counselor for Blackwood Academy. Ms. Hale works closely with both students and faculty and may provide investigators with valuable insight into campus relationships and recent events. At this time, investigators are not releasing excerpts from Ms. Hale's interview. Additional information will be made public as the investigation continues. One final note before we move on. As I was leaving Hawthorne Hall following this week's interviews, I noticed a student standing across the courtyard watching the building. The student remained there for several moments before turning and walking away. At this time, investigators have not identified the individual publicly, nor have they indicated whether the student has any connection to Professor Hammond's death. The observation has simply been documented as part of the ongoing investigation. While investigators continued interviewing witnesses, another important development occurred. Several weeks ago, investigators released the preliminary findings from the medical examiner's office regarding the death of Professor Vanessa Hammond. Since that time, additional examination has been completed, allowing the medical examiner to finalize the autopsy report. Earlier this week, I met with Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Sarah Turner, who agreed to summarize her findings. Dr. Turner? Thank you, investigator. Good evening, detectives. My office has now completed the postmortem examination of Professor Vanessa Hammond. While a small number of laboratory analyses remain pending, I can now summarize the medical findings contained within the completed autopsy. Professor Hammond died as the result of a single forceful blow to the head. The injury caused extensive trauma to the skull and underlying brain tissue and would have resulted in rapid incapacitation. In my professional opinion, Professor Hammond would have lost consciousness almost immediately. The examination revealed no additional significant blunt force injuries elsewhere on the body. Likewise, I found no obvious defensive wounds to the hands or forearms. While the absence of defensive injuries does not eliminate the possibility of a struggle, it may indicate that Professor Hammond had little or no opportunity to defend herself before receiving the fatal injury. Based on the injury pattern, the fatal wound is consistent with impact from a heavy blunt object, possessing a relatively broad striking surface. It is important to clarify that the medical examiner's office does not identify murder weapons. My responsibility is to document injuries and determine whether recovered evidence is medically consistent with those injuries. Identifying the object responsible is ultimately an investigative determination. At this time, toxicology testing has not revealed any findings that would alter the cause or manner of death. Additional trace evidence examinations remain in progress and will be forwarded to investigators upon completion. The manner of death is certified as homicide. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. The completed autopsy provides investigators with a much clearer understanding of how Professor Hammond died. The next challenge is determining who inflicted that fatal injury and why. Investigators also confirmed this week that they have recovered a partially shredded letter addressed to Professor Hammond. Although forensic reconstruction has allowed portions of the document to be preserved, investigators have declined to release the letter publicly while analysis continues. Authorities have not disclosed where the document was recovered, who wrote it, or whether it is directly connected to Professor Hammond's death. For now, it remains another unanswered question. As detectives, it's easy to become focused on individual pieces of evidence. A photograph, a witness statement, a fingerprint, a timeline. But investigations are rarely solved by one clue alone. Instead, they are solved when dozens of seemingly unrelated pieces finally begin to fit together. This week, we've learned more about the woman at the center of the investigation. We've learned that Professor Hammond's friendships ran deeper than many realized. We've met a longtime colleague who challenged her ideas and respected her intellect. We've been introduced to another member of the Blackwood Academy community whose perspective may prove valuable as the investigation continues. We've received the completed medical findings regarding Professor Hammond's death, and we've learned that investigators are now examining yet another piece of documentary evidence. Each answer moves us one step closer to the truth, but many questions remain. Why was Professor Hammond distracted during the final hours of her life? Who authored the partially shredded letter? Who was the unidentified student quietly observing investigators outside Hawthorne Hall? And perhaps most importantly, what happened inside Office 214 after Professor Hammond closed her door at 5:21 that evening? I'm investigator Philomene Ashcroft. Thank you for joining me for this week's case update. I'll see you next Monday. Until then, keep your eyes open, keep your notes organized, and above all, keep asking questions.